Well, last week I kicked off the first Zelda Game Club, the series where we play through the Legend of Zelda games as a community. I'm starting with Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, and this is perhaps one of the most divisive Legend of Zelda games in the series. And over the past week we've been playing through the first half of the game, and today I'm going to run down what we think of the game so far. Well, if you're new around here or find this useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for all the latest Zelda content, and turn on notifications by hitting that bell. And roughly 93% of viewers who watch Triforce Times aren't subscribed, so subscribe today and never miss an update. Well, before we get into part 1 of the Zelda Game Club for Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, if you want to join in, it's not too late. We are going to be playing through the second half of the game this week, and if you want to play along with the community and be included in part 2 of the Game Club, then get your comments to me by Sunday the 7th of August 2022, and the current plan is to release part 2, and that is going to be the final part on the 8th of August. You know, the game isn't very long, it's about 10 or 11 hours or so if you want to play through with us this week, then that would be great. Well, if you do decide to play, then get your comments to me on this video, and let me know what you think of the game. Let me know what you think of the structure of the game, the items, the spells, the RPG mechanics. Do you think The Adventure of Link works, or do you prefer a more traditional Zelda game like the first one, or maybe A Link to the Past? There's definitely no wrong answers. The idea here is to get as many people playing through the Legend of Zelda games together, and over time I would love these community playthroughs to grow, and the more community comments that we get, the more detail we can go into, and the better the community playthrough is. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's dive into Zelda II: The Adventure of Link Part 1. I'm going to run through a brief overview of the game, and then I'm going to weave in some community comments and see what we thought of the first few palaces, and also the game itself. Well, Zelda II: The Adventure of Link was originally released back in 1987, a little under a year after the release of the first Legend of Zelda game on the NES. So this game was a huge change from the first game, given it's side-scrolling, we've got towns, we've got NPCs, there's RPG mechanics in terms of leveling up your attack, your health, and also your magic, and there's plenty more changes as well. That top-down view was retained for the overworld exploration, but the main section of the game takes place in a side-scrolling view, similar to Metroid or the Castlevania games. Now, sword battles were introduced to the game, so when you've got full energy you can shoot a sword from your initial attack, although when you get hit you can't shoot that projectile anymore, and you can attack standing up and also crouching as well. Link's shield is really important and comes into play as he can deflect projectiles. Nintendo also introduced a lives system, so you basically start off with 3 lives, have to make your way through to certain points in the game with that set amount of lives. Die, and you'll have to go back to the start, although you do retain items that you've already collected. The Adventure of Link is definitely a divisive game, with Legend of Zelda fans either loving this entry or not really liking it at all. Personally, for me, it holds a special place in my heart, given it was my first Zelda game, and that actually warped my perception of Zelda games when I was a kid. So given I played through Zelda II with my dad when I was a kid on the original NES, and when it came to playing A Link to the Past on the SNES, I thought that game was a big change, and not having played through the original Legend of Zelda at the time. So there's no doubt at all that this game is difficult, and at times, very, very frustrating. And that was reflected a lot in the comments I had for part 1 of the Adventure of Link Zelda Game Club. So first of all, I want to kick off with a comment from the Triforce Times community from Ikana. So he says, "Alrighty, finally beat the 3rd palace. And I gotta say, this game is as hard as I remember. Death Mountain certainly lives up to its name, as I died several times in that highly forsaken place. And the palaces so far were alright, though I struggled with no magic and half health against that 3rd boss. And that 3rd boss is really, really tricky, so I don't blame you. Honestly, as someone who always tries to find good qualities in every game, it is very hard for me to do so here. The game is very obtuse, even by NES standards, and the combat sections more often felt like slogs instead of exciting gameplay. Well, I suppose that has to do with the life system and how game overs send you back to the start. And I won't lie, without save states, I probably would have quit by the time I got to the Swamp Palace. So the difficulty itself doesn't feel very fair, like in Souls games for instance, and even by the time I learned how to fight most of the enemies without taking damage, it still felt heavily weighted against me, and at times it felt like I was playing a bullet hell instead of a Zelda, looking at you, blue iron knuckles. Well, first of all, thank you Ikana for writing in and playing along with us in the Zelda Game Club. We're going to hear more about your playthrough later on, but first of all I wanted to touch on the subject of difficulty. Zelda II, The Adventure of Link, is definitely difficult. So I had moments against the blue iron knuckles where I was tearing my hair out, I'd have to restart sections, or I was deep in the third palace. When you die, it sends you all the way back to the start. You have to make your way back all the way through the maze. It can be very, very frustrating indeed. Some of the modern conveniences here definitely help to get you through the game. The save states on Nintendo Switch, as Ikana says, they're very useful. Plus there's also the rewind feature. Games have changed a lot since 1987, when this was originally released. So this was at the point where we had a crossover of arcades and video games moving into the living room space with consoles like the NES, and games were still rock solid hard, given arcades were designed to keep you putting money into the machine and to make the most money from that game. Back then, we also didn't have the choice that we have now when it comes to games. For example, if you found something too difficult back then, there were fewer options to move on to. We still have harder games these days, so a few recent examples, we've got Elden Ring, Sifu, Cuphead DLC. They're all examples that have come out in recent months. Sifu is an interesting example though, where they recently released an easy mode given the backlash against the difficulty. Well, going back to Ikana's comments, the gameplay at times does feel obtuse, especially against those blue iron knuckles. They're shooting out flying swords and stabbing at you, standing and crouching, quickly switching things up. Then you've got a flying projectile overhead dropping fire on you at the same time. Yes, it is tough. And I did find myself getting into it after the first few hours though. Initially, I was quite put off by the game, but I did find myself growing into it and then enjoying it by the time I got to the second palace. Well, talking about the palaces, let's have a closer look at the palaces and the structure of what we've played so far. So I arbitrarily split the game into two halves. In the first half, we're tackling the first three palaces, and then in the second half, we're going to take on the 4 remaining palaces. So in the first half, we took on these palaces, so we got Parappa Palace, Midoro Palace, and the Island Palace. So when we first start out, it's a good idea to head to Roru Town. So here we get into one of the core gameplay loops of The Adventure of Link, and that is speaking to the town's NPCs and finding the secrets that are hidden in that town. So in the towns, you tend to have a couple of women who are willing to help you out at all times. There's a woman in a red dress who comes out of a building. If you speak to her, she's going to restore your health. Then if you speak to the old woman, she's going to restore your magic meter. Then in each town, you've got a wise man. They're normally going to teach you a spell. And in the first town, we get our first spell, and that is the shield spell. So we don't really have to do much here to get to the old man. Just look out for the woman in that purple dress, speak to her, and she's going to invite you in to speak to her father. But in later towns, you're going to have to find items to trade with the NPC to get them to let you in, but given this is the first one, it is quite nice and easy. So I want to jump over to another Triforce Times community member now, Bombs the Coffee, and he says, I think the towns should have shops to buy potions instead of going with the NPC to heal yourself, and a way to get a bottle to put a fairy in it. The thing I like about the towns is helping out the NPC to get to the old man. Well, thanks so much, Bombs the Coffee, really appreciate you taking the time to play through the game and also writing a comment in as well. Hope you're getting on well playing the game, and I really hope you are enjoying it. So I do like that idea about the shop, and I think that was probably introduced in the next game in A Link to the Past. Now I don't know if we had restrictions here on the NES, which made that very complicated. I'm not a game developer, but I do agree with you on your second point. I like the mechanic of helping out that NPC to get to the old man. Sometimes the puzzles are pretty simple. For example, you meet an old lady who's thirsty, then you walk up to the fountain and get some water for her. The interesting thing with these old NES games is you don't really get an animation of Link collecting the water or anything like that, so you really have to pay attention to the dialogue boxes. Well, there's another puzzle in the second town, I think, where someone has lost a mirror and you find it under the table in another house. That is a good example of not really having any clues, and in this game you simply have to walk around, find objects and interact with them. There's no prompt or anything like that, so if you walk up to the table, it won't say look under the table to find the mirror. You just have to press the button and hope there's an action. This does lead to some great moments of excitement when you finally find something, whether it be an item that you find or whether you fall down a big random hole to reveal a magic container or a new passageway to reach a palace. So after exploring the overworld a little bit, we find ourselves in the first palace, and that is the Parappa Palace. This introduces us to more platforming, and also we've got some battling some tough enemies for the first time. We've got mace throwers, which can be tough to dodge, but this is the perfect place to try out the magic spells, the one we learnt back in the town, and that spell is going to help protect us. I think basically it halves the damage that we get from all the enemies, so it is really, really useful. We also have to find the keys and use them to unlock doors, plus we got the dungeon items, and the first one is the candle. The candle is very helpful for finding a way through the dark caves, which you're going to encounter on the way to the first palace. Yeah, we're introduced to the first boss here, and he's called Horsehead. It's not really too tricky, you just have to watch your sword and try not to get hit by it. And once you're done, you add the crystal back into the stone, and it's on to the next palace. And that is pretty much the gameplay loop of Zelda II: The Adventure of Link. So explore the overworld to find a town, find the old wise man in the town to get that spell, and that's going to help you in the upcoming palace, find your way to the palace, maybe solving a puzzle along the way, find the item in the palace which generally helps you explore the overworld even more, and then beat the boss in the palace to progress. So going back to Ikana's comments, he says, "Despite my previous negative statements, there is enjoyment to be found in the game, and I've overall had a positive experience, although knowing that others are struggling alongside me helps me a lot. The music in the game is pretty good, with the palace theme being one of my favourite themes in the series, and I find myself humming the overworld theme when I'm going about my day." Well, thanks again, Ikana, and I thought your first comments were pretty objective, to be honest. The game is tough, or obtuse at times. I wouldn't worry about being negative. I think you're absolutely being accurate. You know, I agree with what you're saying here. There is enjoyment to be had from playing the game. It takes a little bit of time to get into, but once you're in, I found myself completely in, and hopefully many of you out there playing along with us agree with me there. You know, knowing that other players are playing together definitely helps, and thank you to anyone who's playing along. Really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, or whatever game you're currently playing. It's really, really appreciated, and I hope you continue to play along with part 2. The more players we have, the better that we can support each other through the tough times, like fights with the blue iron knuckles. Well, I think you're absolutely right with the comment about the music. It is very, very good. Now, the overworld theme is a nice switch up on the more traditional Zelda theme, and the palace theme is really, really good too. So if you like Zelda music and you like all the theories behind it, I would definitely recommend a podcast called Strong Songs, specifically the episode about the music of Legend of Zelda. So Kirk Hamilton, a former games journalist from Kotaku, he goes into depth about Zelda music, and given he's a professional musician and teacher, he can do a much better job of explaining and going through the theory that I can. So go and check out that Zelda Music Strong Songs episode. It's really, really good. It's about an hour long, but he goes into detail on loads of Zelda music and also some little hidden Easter eggs in the Zelda music too. Go over there and subscribe to Strong Songs. And Kirk Hamilton, he's a really, really good podcaster as well. So I hope you enjoy that episode. And what I'll do, I'll make it nice and easy now. I'll link it down in the description. I definitely recommend, after you finish listening to this, go and listen to that Zelda music episode. Okay, so back to Zelda II: The Adventure of Link. So after the first palace, well, that is definitely where I hit my first frustrating point in the game, and that was Death Mountain. So here, you have to enter a series of caves through a random maze to get to the point where you can find the hammer to destroy the big boulders on the world map. So Death Mountain killed me plenty of times, plus going through the series of caves fighting the enemies with axes, had me jumping up and down in frustration. So you've got a useful spell that you can learn in Water Town of Saria that helps you restore life. It costs a lot of magic, but it is definitely a lifesaver when it comes to navigating Death Mountain. So also going back to Ikana's first comment where they said Death Mountain certainly lives up to its name. Yes, that is absolutely true, and getting through Death Mountain is a little bit of a slog. Well, I think this is where I learnt the jumping slash technique for enemies, which was a real lifesaver for me. Now, rather than have Link stand or crouch and go into battles, if you jump forward and slash when you're coming down, you can inflict a good amount of damage on your enemies and then quickly get away. So this works really well with the enemies are throwing things at you, as you can time it and jump over their projectiles, and also then jump into them and attack simultaneously. Now, I probably left it way too late to learn this technique, but it's something I took into future palaces and found pretty good success with. So once you find the hammer, you can then move around the overworld map a little bit more freely and make your way to the town of Mido, where you learn your first new sword technique with the downward strike. So this is definitely another one of those moments, similar to when you find the mirror or the water to give to the NPCs, and it's a real moment of discovery. So when you're in the town of Mido, you have to use the jump spell to jump up to the church, then go into the door to meet the knight who teaches you that new attacking technique, and that is really going to come in handy for the next palace, plus also navigating the overworld, because it gives you the ability to jump over enemies without getting damaged. Well, Midoro Palace is found hidden away in the swamps of Hyrule, so in this palace you're going to find a bunch of tough new enemies, plus also the handy glove. That allows you to break certain blocks with a sword strike, and it's also going to allow you to better navigate the overworld, and also smash through blocks in palaces to get keys or reach places you otherwise couldn't reach. Now, the boss battle here in Midoro is a step up from the first boss. This guy is called Helmet Head, and you have to knock off his head twice to reveal his face, and then attack frantically while his two previous heads are flying around trying to zap you. It is pretty tough, but it is doable if you've got a good amount of magic. Well, after Midoro Palace is probably one of my favourite moments in the game so far. So in the town of Mido, you have to deliver the Water of Life, which you found in a cave thanks to the hammer, and upon delivering that Water of Life you get a new spell that turns you into a fairy. Well, at first I was confused as to what this is for, but it all becomes clear when you find the King's Tomb. Now, you get a clue from a character in one of the towns earlier on to go south from King's Tomb, and you'll find yourself falling into a secret hole. So use that fairy spell and you'll find your way up onto the next palace, and that is the Island Palace. Well, let's go back to Bombs the Coffee, and he says, I've just made it to the Island Palace, and I think this game is actually fun, but in some parts it is annoying, like the flying skulls that shoot at you, so what might make this game a little bit easier is if they had a bow and arrow. I'm trying not to rewind too many times, though technically I did die about 10 times. You know, I totally agree, Bombs the Coffee. The flying skulls and generally anything that flies in the game is pretty annoying. So I think here in the Island Palace, you've got those horse head-like flying enemies who fly in a wave pattern towards you. You know, they are really, really tough. I really do like the idea of a bow and arrow. It'd be interesting to see what a difference that would make to this game. This is almost like an 8-bit Souls game at times, with swords and shields crashing together, making for some great battles, but also unforgiving deaths. So I use the rewind feature as well, Bombs of Coffee, so no worries about that. I do remember playing through this game as a kid, and I don't really remember how far I got. In my mind, I think I completed it, although I reckon my dad probably helped me through it when I wasn't looking. You know, dying only 10 times is pretty good going, and I dread to think what my personal death counter has been throughout the playthrough of this first half of the game. Well, the Island Palace ramps up the difficulty even more with orange, red and blue iron knuckles. So the first blue iron knuckle is a shock to the system for sure. You know, in this palace we find the raft, which allows us to travel to other parts of Hyrule, plus we got the boss fight with Rebanak, a blue knight who starts out on horseback, but with a few well-placed downward strikes he falls off, and it's just a regular blue iron knuckle, which, to be honest, is no easy feat to deal with. Well, that is about it for the first half of Zelda II The Adventures of Link, and I hope you've enjoyed playing along so far, and if you still want to join in, then it's not too late. You can join in this week and then play along with the Triforce Times community. You know, whether you're playing the game for the first time or rekindling your love for the Zelda franchise, everyone is welcome to play along in this big community effort. Well, that's a few details and opinions about the first half of the game and the first 3 palaces, but I wanted to pull a few details, and here I went to the Zelda fandom website. So I wanted to talk about the development a little bit. So they say, development of The Adventure of Link started with Shigeru Miyamoto's idea of creating a side-scrolling action game which used up and down movements for attacks and defense. This idea was developed as a new sword and shield action game that did not follow the system seen in the first Legend of Zelda. At the end of the development, the game was considered a type of spin-off, until it was decided on the story where Link would be 16 years old, attaching the Zelda title to it. Well, the levelling up system was added so players could battle enemies multiple times, and while encounters on the overworld added a luck factor to the narrow map. The high difficulty of the game was implemented to extend playing sessions due to the lack of content in games at the time. Well, next up, let's have a look at the timeline placement. So both this game and the first, they're linked in continuity, since the first game revolves around retrieving 2 of the major fragments of the Triforce, and Ganon is fought in order to rescue Princess Zelda. The second game revolves around finding the third major fragment in order to revive an incarnation of Zelda that was sleeping for a very long time to impede the revival of Ganon. In the timeline revealed in Hyrule Historia, the Adventure of Link takes place in the Downfall branch after the Ocarina of Time. So it's the latest entry in the timeline that has its roots in the Ocarina of Time and starts with A Link to the Past. After Ganon is defeated in A Link to the Past, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, A Link Between Worlds, Hyrule then entered the Golden Era, in which the wise Hyrule monarchs used the Triforce to govern the land. After the last king's death and the attempt of the Prince of Hyrule to assemble the complete Triforce, Hyrule was led into the Era of Decline. The Prince of Darkness Ganon was revived, leading to the events of The Legend of Zelda, but he was ultimately defeated by Link. And the events of The Adventure of Link take place a few years later, but refer back to Princess Zelda that was put under a sleeping spell at the beginning of the Era of Decline. Well, next up, let's have a look at the sales figures for the game. So The Adventure of Link was a commercial success, selling 4.38 million copies worldwide, and being the 5th best-selling Nintendo Entertainment System game of all time. However, it did sell less than its predecessor, and that sold 6.51 million copies. Also, I've got some trivia for Zelda II, The Adventure of Link. Although the Japanese title for The Adventure of Link uses the English name of The Legend of Zelda, and the game's backstory explicitly defines The Legend of Zelda as a plot concept, the English language game is the only one in the main series not to include The Legend of Zelda in its title. Well, The Adventure of Link marks one of the few times where Link speaks in the main game by saying, "I found a mirror under the table" while in Saria Town, and also, "looks like I can get into the fireplace," and he says that in Kasuto. The Famicom Disk System version of the game uses the infamous Ganon, spelt Ganon, spelling in the intro, as well as other typos such as Triforce, spelt with a Y. This intro was largely rewritten in the North American release. According to the series creator Shigeru Miyamoto, The Adventure of Link is the only Legend of Zelda game he considers to be a failure, this due to the limitations of the hardware. And finally, Ganon's laugh on the game over screen in the English version is also used in the NES game Punch-Out as Soda Popinski's laugh. As a massive fan of the original Punch-Out game, I didn't know that little piece of trivia, so hopefully you found some interesting little nuggets of information there. Well, I want to go back to another comment from Ekana. So they say, if Adventure of Link was released today, I think it could be a good game if it had several quality of life updates. Here's to the second half of the game, and hopefully we can get through it in one piece. So I definitely agree, Ekana. I think this one is a prime candidate for a modern remake. And much like Link's Awakening had a particular art style for that Switch remake released in 2019, I'd love to see a new art style developed for a remake version of The Adventure of Link. Let me know in the comments what art style you'd like to see, and also, yes, here's to the second part of the Zelda Game Club. Definitely looking forward to playing the final remaining palaces this week. Well, also I want to shout out NotYoshi124 and also Warrior Princess for writing in via the comments. So NotYoshi124 said, "It's a very good idea, but I don't think I'm going to be joining until Wind Waker." Well, NotYoshi124, keep an eye on the channel for more Zelda Game Clubs coming very, very soon. And the next one is going to be A Link to the Past, and that is one of the best games of all time. But we definitely will get to Wind Waker after we go through Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time, and also Majora's Mask. I'm going to be playing through all the Zelda games with you as a community, so NotYoshi124, I look forward to playing Wind Waker with you and the community in a Zelda Game Club in the future. Also, shout out to Warrior Princess who said, "I'm playing Breath of the Wild because I prefer that game more, but I am looking forward to Breath of the Wild too." Well, no worries, Warrior Princess, Breath of the Wild is a great game, but I would give these older Zelda games a try. It's great to see where these game mechanics come from, and also all the build up to Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild does have a lot in common with the original Legend of Zelda game released on the NES, and it's close to being a current gen reimagining of that game. So if you like Breath of the Wild, I would definitely recommend going back and trying some of the older games. I think they're really, really good. If you want to play through with us as a community, you are more than welcome. So finally, this isn't a required part of the Zelda Game Club, but it's definitely something for fans of Zelda II, The Adventure of Link. So I started collecting physical classic NES games, and this is the first game in my collection, the original gold cartridge of Zelda II The Adventure of Link, complete with a box, even though the box has a few folds, tears and also scratches. Now, given we're playing through the game, I thought I'd share that with you all. Well, that is all for part 1 of the first Zelda Game Club for Zelda II The Adventure of Link. Now, this week we are playing through the second half of the game. That's 4 palaces including Maze, Ocean, Hidden, and also the final one, the Great Palace. So do get your comments to me by Sunday the 7th of August 2022. I'm going to publish part 2 on Monday the 8th of August, and that's going to include all of your comments. So a massive thank you to everyone who's been playing along with us, especially to those who sent in their comments for part 1. The plan is to continue with the Zelda series, working our way through all the games to the modern games. So once we finish Zelda II The Adventure of Link, we're going to move on A Link to the Past. I don't have a set date for that one just yet, but it's likely to be in August or October 2022, depending on my timing for my summer break. Well, that is the future, but for now, let's focus on finishing Zelda II The Adventure of Link. Now, I don't know about you, but I wasn't really sure what to think when I first went into this playthrough, but so far I'm really enjoying it. I remembered a few details from my original playthrough when I was a kid, but it's been 30 years since I played through that original game on the NES, and this has given me a fresh perspective on the Zelda franchise, plus it's a very different Zelda game to almost all the others in the series. Well, let me know in the comments what you think of the Zelda Game Club. I would love to hear what you think, and we're going to iterate this over time as a community, and I'd love it for as many of you to get involved as possible. Well, that is it for part 1 of the first Zelda Game Club for Zelda II The Adventure of Link, and as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. For more Legend of Zelda content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to Triforce Times, or you can follow me on Twitter at Triforce Times. Well, if you enjoyed this video, found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the other videos on the channel. Well, thanks again, and I'll see you for part 2.